Okay, we were just talking about death, the biological death, the idea that the human body perishes and passes into the earth, this mortal reality known as death. Notice what Lacan does with this theme at the top of page 289. In order for the transference relationship to escape these effects, the analyst would have to strip the narcissistic image of his own ego from all the forms of desire by which that image has been constituted, reducing it to the only face that sustains it behind their masks, the face of the absolute master, death. The absolute master of mortal reality is death, because it's the one thing that we all do. We can't escape it. And the analyst has a role to play in this. Now let's see, the dots we have going so far are fragmented body, that the baby feels in themselves as they look at an image in the mirror. And Lacan says the fragmented body is touched with death, tinged with death. It has a mortal reality to it because it is so extremely fragile, but also because we know that the end of the line for embodiment is death. And now he's going to say the analyst has a job to do on this theme and should effectively play dead. So what type of a listener are we talking about here? Listening is not a passive act, as we often think of it. But what would it mean to listen as though dead? To live as though dead, even more further than that. Let's see how far Lacan wants to go with this on 289. It is thus clearly here that the analysis of the ego finds its ideal terminus, end, that in which the subject, having refound the origins of his ego in an imaginary regression, comes by the progression of remembering to its end in analysis, namely the subjectification of his death. Lacan is here suggesting that the analyst, in playing dead, can help the patient or the analysand subjectify or come to terms with their own mortality. That's what he means when he says subjectification of his death. He's talking about the patient coming to terms with the fact that their life will eventually end. There's a very real sense in which psychoanalysis is about learning how to die. Because once you learn how to die and can imagine that ultimate horizon, you now know how to live more fully. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean this. If you imagine yourself on your deathbed, imagine yourself 60 years from now, 40 years from now, 100 years from now, whatever the heck it is. You're at the end of your life, and you're looking back on your life, reflecting on all the things that you've done. What up to this point in your life will you remember? Well, you'll probably remember interactions with your parents, positive or negative. You'll probably remember first loves, traveling, trips you've taken. Are you going to remember this lecture? Maybe. Probably not, though. You're probably not going to remember today. Today in particular is probably not going to be one of those days that you carry with you until your deathbed. You're not going to look back and think about today. Now, that doesn't mean today doesn't have issues. You might be concerned right now. As I record this lecture, it's February 22nd, 2022. That means we're just about at the end of the month, which means rent is due. You might be sweating your rent payment right now. Now, you know you're going to get it done, but it's going to be tight. And you're stressing about it. You were up late last night. You lost sleep over this. In 60 years, when you're on your deathbed, are you going to look back and remember the end of February and that rent payment that you almost didn't make? Probably not. So what's the answer? The answer is, if on your deathbed you're not going to be tripping about rent that you almost didn't make in February 2022, don't trip about rent on February 22nd. It'll be fine. This is how it works. Once you have a being towards death, once you imagine yourself on your deathbed, you can look back and determine what's of value and what's not. People on their deathbed they usually don't look back and wish they had spent more time at the office, doing more work. They wish they had spent more time traveling, being with family, taking time to do things that you might now find kind of annoying, like a family trip, like going to visit your relatives, and the like. That's the kind of stuff people look back on and value. See, it's tough. The present is always blind to what the future will value, as one of my friends often says. That's an important thing to note. You don't know right now what in 60 years is going to prove to have been, what will have been, the most important parts of your life. So this imaginative exercise where you imagine yourself on your deathbed looking back, it helps you figure out how to live a good life today. And that's what's at stake here. By learning how to die, by coming to terms with the ultimate, absolute master that is death, it doesn't mean you live a pointless, morbid life. On the contrary, just the opposite. It's from the vantage point of death that you can truly understand how to live, because now your priorities are clear. On your deathbed, the rent payment that you know you're going to make, even though it's going to be stressful here in a few days, you're not going to be tripping about that. So don't trip about it now. Focus your energy elsewhere. That is how you live a good life. And this is ultimately what it means to live as though dead. When Zeno went to the oracle and asked, and the oracle said, "Live as though dead," Zeno thought, that must mean that I should read all the old books. Read books by dead people. Not so. To live as though dead is to live an extremely full life. This is what it means to live one's best life, is to live it as though dead. As if on your deathbed looking back, you would make some decisions. You see, when you get old, you're not going to be able to climb mountains anymore. Your body just won't do it. Now, if that's the kind of thing that you think you might regret and wish you had done later in life, you better damn well start climbing mountains now, while you still have the ability to do it. This is the type of life that is worth living according to Lacan. This is the payoff of all of this work with death. The subjectification of your death that Lacan talks about on 289 is going to culminate in a richer life in the meantime. The meantime between psychoanalysis, when you came to terms with your death, and the fact of you dying somewhere down the road. The goal here is to live a richer, better, more enjoyment-driven life. And the best way to do that is to come to terms with death. And the best way to come to terms with death, Lacan is here suggesting, is for the analyst to play a very specific part for you. To play dead. Now we're going to see how this unfolds as we read on. We're on page 289. And this is supposed, the paragraph begins, to be the end required of the analyst's ego, but about whom we can say that he must acknowledge the prestige of but one master, death, in order for life, which he must guide through its so many vicissitudes, to be his friend. In order for life to be your friend, you must acknowledge the prestige of death. You must come to terms with death as your absolute master in order to make life your friend, in order to live an amicable, happy life. This goal does not seem beyond human grasp, for it does not imply that for him or for others, death is anything more than an illusion. Notice the word here, prestige, interesting. And it merely satisfies the requirements of his task, like someone like Ferenczi has defined earlier. This imaginary condition can only be brought about nevertheless through an ascesis, that's like intense self-discipline, that is affirmed in a being by following a path along which all objective knowledge is progressively suspended. That's interesting. Objective knowledge is suspended in death and at the level of death because nobody knows what that's like. Nobody's lived to tell us what it's like to be dead. This is true because for the subject, the reality of his own death is in no wise an object that can be imagined. You can imagine yourself on your deathbed, but being dead, man, who knows what that's like? And the analyst can know nothing about it, no more than anyone else, except that he is a being destined to die. The analyst and the analysand are both beings that are destined to die. The analyst is someone who has come to terms with this and can play a certain part to help you come to terms with it. Thus, assuming he has eliminated all the illusions, prestiges, of his ego in order to accede to being toward death, no other knowledge, whether immediate or constructed, can be preferred by him to be made a power of, assuming it is not simply abolished thereby. So we're talking about something that is beyond knowledge. And whenever you hear Lacan talking about something other than knowledge, note that he's probably talking about truth. We've been through this. The ego is fascinated by knowledge, especially knowledge of itself. The ego is someone who's always trying to know themselves. That is their highest priority. Knowledge is the priority of the ego. Truth is the priority of the unconscious. The goal is not to be aware of oneself, even though that's very important. The goal is to be aware of all the ways in which you will always be unaware of certain parts of yourself. In other words, to realize that the task of knowing thyself will always remain complete, that knowledge is always buffered by an ignorance that can't be addressed. And this ignorance, hold on, because Lacan's going to define it in a very interesting way. We're still on page 289, talking about this analyst who has to play a certain part in relation to death. Thus, he can now respond to the subject from the place he wants to respond from, but he no longer wants anything that determines this place. The place from which the analyst responds is not unlike the place in which the baby found themselves, feeling fragmented, tinged with death, on the verge of death all the time because life was so fragile when you lack all those motor skills. This is the impotence, the prematurity at birth, and the lack of motor coordination that we heard about on pages 286 and 287. This is the place from which the analyst listens and responds to the patient or the analysand's discourse. Scrolling down a little bit on 289, the analyst's approach cannot be left to the indeterminacy of a freedom of indifference, nevertheless. But the usual watchword of benevolent neutrality does not provide sufficient indication here. Lacan is here trying to define a position occupied by the analyst that plays dead, that plays dumb, because in being dead is occupying a space beyond knowledge, a space of ignorance, a space that is especially ignorant relative to the analysand, who can't bear to remember all the ways in which they are fragmented, incoherent, dependent, and the like. The ego really can't stand that about itself, about the body to which it's attached, that it is mortal. And so it's the job of the analyst to help the ego encounter that. We're reading forward, eyeing the end of this essay, which is going to end exactly where it began, on the topic of speech.